So excited to be connecting with you, and thank you so much for being open to this conversation. I
Yes.
would love to start the conversation with how you personally orient and organize and define around the concept of trauma.
Okay. Well, it's good to meet you too, brother. And
Thank-
I was just telling someone a while ago that my jet lag has jet lag. So I'm fine, but in a very troubling way.
I
Yeah,
feel you.
but this feels like a good question to land to as I just returned from Bremen. Uh, Um, I feel what I would want to respond to is how I orient around it. I'm very suspicious of definitions. Um, but one idea, I mean, the popular dominant mainstream account of trauma is as an external event that impacts the self, right? I think most people would agree, no matter your psychological tradition, whether it's humanistic or psychodynamic, you know, something impacts the self, an external event. Now, in that seemingly simple and ordinary description of trauma lurks a boatload of theoretical significance, which would be, it would seem to me that that definition, if you will, or description already has an orientation or an idea about what the self is, right? It's already a political designation of where the self is, where it begins and where it stops, right? Because if it can talk about something external, then there's already a cosmological or spiritual or philosophical commitment to this is the self and this is not the self. So that in a sense, my orientation to trauma has been for some time that trauma is how capitalism reinforces and shapes the self.
Hmm.
Trauma is an insurance policy for self-continuity. It's the wound, right? I would use descriptors like the wound and the opening. But it is also um, a way of returning to an idea of what the self is as an atomized entity within modern algorithms, right?
Yeah.
Um, so there's a political commitment to an isolated or dissociated self, right? And that opens up with that description, which seems Deleuzian or Batesonian. It opens up this vast field of new considerations. Like, what do we do when we say we're healing? Right? It could be that we're restoring boundaries, which becomes problematic. Right, but let me stop there.
No, no, don't, please. I'll perhaps reflect back what I'm hearing, and then we can keep
Yeah.
diving in
Yes.
further.
Yes. Yes.
And I love this because I think it's taken so long his from in the history of Western conception of trauma to go from, oh, it's just an event that happens to you, to,
Yes.
oh, it's the internal experience of the event or circumstances or
Yes.
etc. In relation to like somatics and the body.
Yes.
And I think you're adding such an important nuanced layer, which is if it's about the self and this limited conception of self, where self actually, and what I hear you reflecting is like, you are part of me, my community is part of me, the
Mhm.
trees are part of me. The idea, this limited conception of self, of where trauma is occurring, is actually part of the problem.
Mm, mm. This is what those two famous French philosophers, Deleuze and Guattari, this
Just
is
those
where,
two.
right? They would speak about schizoanalysis and basically their critique of of psychodynamic theories, psychodynamism, was it was performing too closed and tight a place, right? It was like its interventions, to address trauma, for instance, enact some kind of closure. It's some kind of capture because it divorces the self from the economic circumstances, the environmental conditions that create the symptoms, right? So it feels like a Procrustean bed, if you will. The Greek the story, Hesiod of Procrustes, who captures people and puts them on his bed and then cuts them down to size. If your feet or your hands or arms, extend beyond the bed, he cuts it. And if you're not as tall or wide as the bed, he would stretch you out to size. So it's the violence of repetition or tautology or cyclicity. So the trauma is not just an internal experience, it's a world-shaping paradigm.
Yeah.
It's how bodies are composed, reinforced, and restored to an image, right? Yes.
And I think, it's not an easy idea to embody that, like,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so there's a way in which I think even stepping into this conception of this is not the self. This is
Yeah.
a aspect of the self, or
Yes.
however we want to frame it.
Yes.
And it's like, but what we could say is, look, when there is trauma here, it doesn't just happen in a vacuum. You have a behavioral response. You have a resonant, a physiological response it doesn't have a boundary. It leaks.
Yes. Yes.
It leaks
Yes.
into the environment. It affects the
Yeah.
environment.
Yes.
And I'm just saying, perhaps that's a stepping stone way to understand, like, the trauma that happens here doesn't just stay here.
Yes. And it doesn't just also happen there,
No.
right? It feels like things just don't spill out, they spill in. Right,
Yes.
right.
Yeah.
There is a sense in which, yeah, and of course, I appreciate that you're noticing the difficulty of conveying this, and both of us are sensing into larger ecological happenings and flows that mean that it's very difficult for people to conceive of the self as anything other than the fixated images that present themselves to us when we look in a mirror or on a Zoom call, right? But how do we tell people that you're not just the wave in the ocean, but you're the ocean in its specific materiality?
Yeah.
Right. You are not that you are connected to stuff, because that would presume there's a you prior to the connection, but you are relationality gaining specificity.
Well said.
And so trauma is not a matter of, oh, like there's a politics that goes with this, and there's an interesting genealogy of how trauma came to be a term, how it came to be a vocation, right? And one might even argue that the reason why the New York Times and various editorials are noticing trauma, the word trauma, as the most used term of this decade,
very popular,
is because there's something happening, something geological, philosophical maybe. There's something happening to society, to the Holocene or to the Anthropocene, to modernity, that is squeezing the space of the citizen, of our bodies. And so we are experiencing, how migration is heating up around the world, right? Their borders are being, pressed by the weight and the burden of humanity wanting to move around. It's also the same way the heat of settlement and sedimentation and humanity is pressing upon our skin and querying or calling into question the boundaries we've adopted, right? let me put it this way, brother, if you allow me for a moment. um I remember speaking with a babalawo. Now that's the name for a priest who is a healer and also a lawyer of some kind, a cosmic lawyer. Well,
cosmic lawyer.
not
I was
not
like, I
before,
didn't know
not
that.
before a court of law. No, that would make for an interesting sci-fi
That would make for an
thing. I could think about that further, both of us maybe. But the cosmic lawyer, because the way they approach divination, for instance, is that they'll argue in your case before ancestors and gods. Like, but I digress. I spoke with some of them, I think about 13 years ago when I was doing my PhD. And this was for my doctoral work. And I remember one of them saying to me after I said, how do you address auditory hallucination? We're in the part of the conversation where I was examining, their nosological framework, their diagnostic criteria. And I said, how do you treat that? How do you address that? And he was like, why is that a thing? Why is that a problem? I don't understand why that's a problem. Why hearing voices is a problem.
Yeah.
What if that's your grandmother? He said, what if that's an ancestor reaching out? So it was not immediately clear to him why hearing voices in your head, so to speak, was pathological. To him, it was a spiritual crisis of some kind.
Yeah.
But he never started from the presumption that ourselves are private entities, self-enclosed things. He started from the presumption, from the proposition that selves flow and we're open and porous. Like you said, things spill in and they spill out. I think that's what we are not able to capture or really language living in environments like these. We presume that we are not possessible. We presume that we are our own selves and we're never beside ourselves. We presume that we're static instead of ecstatic.
Yeah.
So trauma seems to be part of the technology of the city, and of industrial frameworks and of modern progressive teleological ideas of time to preserve the self as an atom, right? To continually cut off the boundaries and to treat the openings as wounds, as things to be solved. Yes.
So, I mean, that's so complex, nuanced, and
I know.
No, and I love it, and it's like this, for those of us who have spent many years in non-dual spaces, there's an accessibility to what you're saying, and it's interesting because one of the things that we could even say is one of the aspects of trauma is that it brings us into dualism. It brings us into this idea of individuation without connection, even within ourselves. And so, like, when I reflect back, the complexity of it's not complex once you've had an embodied experience of this sort of non-dual space of this, that we are the ocean and the individual waves, articulations within that ocean. When we have been in the industrial complex, when we have had generations and generations of quote unquote division and forced dissociation, as we know from generational trauma or from cultural trauma, that way, that it's like, how do we get back to what often we might think of as healing? But what I also hear in what you're presenting is what we get back to is this holism that isn't just this holism. It's the holism of, I mean, I keep using the term non-dual. I don't know if that's appropriate for you.
Go ahead. Yes, it is. It makes sense to me.
but it feels like what we're talking about is a bigger sense of healing is returning back to our state of ultimate connection. That that doesn't just feel like individuals connecting, but something much more non-dual, which is just the embodied experience of interconnection.
I mean, even the individual is embodied. Let, let me let me explain it this way. There is a sense in which this conversations around entanglement, you know, which we might, for conversational purposes, use intersperse or just use alongside the idea of embodiment, entanglement, embodiment, right? A holistic notion of bodies in connection. There's a sense in which we speak about entanglement / embodiment as the other side of the coin, you know, of separation, right? So we would say, hey, we are in modernity, so we're separate, and the idea is to get back to embodiment or back to entanglement. But I'm a monist in the sense that I think we are always in embodied relations with the world. The question is, particular cultures or particular natures emerge that perform this turning away from those relations, right? Like whether we have a language for it or not, we are continually haunted, even modern citizens in the most industrialized and most highly advanced nations, are haunted and disturbed and, you know, and surrounded by ancestors, right? And by microbial beings. If you don't want to go the ancestral path, I think microbes are also ancestral.
I like how you're putting on the same plane microbial beings and ancestors.
Yes. I think of them sometimes in the same breath, right?
As a biologist, I really appreciate it.
Good. There you go. I mean, I was just telling some people just a while ago in Italy that our faces are not even ours. Our faces are not even ours, right? It's not even the idea of the deep fakes and what the digital is doing to our bodies, to see how our bodies are already virtual digital embodiments, right? It's also noticing, I forget the name of this creature that lives in our faces. I hear it's too small, that it lives, it's so tiny, so invisible to that it lives. If you scratch a bit of skin off, you would see them there, right? It starts with an N. I forget. Forgive me. My jet lag has jet lag, right? Like I said. Maybe you might recall the name, but they live in our faces. They are born in our faces. They live in our faces. They defecate on our faces. They get married on our faces. They have their entire university education on our faces. They live lifetimes in our faces. So whose face is it then? Whose face is it, right? Our faces are literally ecologies for multi-species arrangements. So this is, whether we acknowledge that or not, it's happening, it's there, right? So it's not the idea that we need to get back to entanglement. It's that we are already participating in these rhizomatic networks of becoming. We're using and we're being used, right? But we just don't know. We don't have the technology to align or attune ourselves to that, right?
Would you say we are the technology? But
we are
external technology.
I mean, it depends on what you mean by we. The we is also dynamic and always changing. If you're speaking about, for instance, a hybrid of Dr. Scott and a microscope, then that technology allows you to appreciate your ancestral lineages on your face, right? If you're speaking about Dr. Scott and a psychedelic experience, that's a different embodied relationship, and it allows you to access different things. So the world works by these complementarity, right? things will get excluded, some other things will be brought into clarity, but it depends on the alliances we build. It's not a thing that, oh, I'm separate, we need to cross the bridge to entanglement. It's that even separation is a performance of entanglement.
Shit. Yeah, I mean, okay, so I hear that even separateness is a performance of entanglement, which
Yeah.
deserves its own t-shirt. Just
Okay.
so
Okay.
we'll
I'll
definitely,
write it down.
yeah, write it down. We'll
Write
get
it.
merch.
Yeah.
Um,
And yeah.
but and is the separateness that occurs that when we're talking about trauma, like, is that are you identifying that as performative, or is that still, going back to this idea of like, if trauma is the interruption of this embodied entanglement, this connection, uh,
Mm-hmm.
well, or let me just say it as a phrase, so like, trauma then perhaps is the interruption, the veil, the maya
Yeah. Yeah.
of this existence of connection, of community, of this ecological us.
Yes. There's a duplicity to that interruption, right? From one end, we can notice that what trauma is doing is planting altars to the agnostos theos, or to the unknown God. It's how we're marking the public. It's simultaneously saying, from here on out is the wilds, don't go there. This is where the body is, right? So we're doing two things. We're naming the body, and we're ritualizing and setting its boundaries. We're christening what it means to be a proper human, but we're also acknowledging something else outside, right? It's the cleaving, with the duplicity of the word cleaving, right? The word hides two things. To cleave is to come together, right? And to cleave is to also to tear apart, right? Right? To cleave together and cleave apart. The word is one of the most dangerous words, because it's doing two things. It's unsure of itself. I
Yeah.
think trauma also marks that spot. A good way to describe this might be to use the words that a sister, dear friend of mine, used some time ago. She said that biotrauma is not just where the meteor lands and impacts. Trauma is the cultures and the assemblages that emerge around that shock,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not even a human phenomenon, right? Right. It's also how bags and streets and buildings and public policies materialize from impacts,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely.
To keep the impact at bay. And interesting genealogies might help, spell this out even further. But these are my thoughts on that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think they're absolutely brilliant thoughts, in the sense that, like, we know also, like, if we were to just take the individualized perspective for a moment,
Yes. Yeah.
as just a placeholder of going, we know that trauma is not just about the impact, it's about what
Yes.
happens in relation to and in preparation for the next perceived impact.
Yes. Yes.
The way, the modification of our senses, the modification of our, through like things like hypervigilance, or tuning
Yes.
our
Yes.
senses now to the next possible negative issue,
Yes.
then our perception, our reality gets built around that.
Yes.
So what I
Yes.
love that you're naming is, it's not just on an individual level. The meteor lands, and a whole change occurs that mimics what I was just saying on the individual level.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
It's what
It,
happens
it's
in the interstitial space between
mhm.
the impact and the next perceived.
Indeed, indeed. It's marking. We're marking. We're making marks in a forest of become. We're building territory
Yeah.
with this. It feels like, and along the lines of the unperturbed individual. Let's take that for granted. The unperturbed, undisturbed, uncontroversial, unironic individual, right? It seems a lot of therapeutic interventions stress developmental pathways, or intergenerational. So it's a long line human sociality, how humans are interacting with other humans. So what happened to you when you were a kid? And this is how we start our analysis of trauma. And then we say, hey, Black people, for instance, in the United States, suffer intergenerational trauma because this happened along these lines. So it's developmentalism, if you will, for stretched or writ large. And that is useful to the extent that it allows us to see how bodies tumble into other bodies, right? But it doesn't go as far as noticing that trauma, again, is not a human phenomenon. It's not just intergenerational either. It is paradigmatic. Trauma could define how bodies relate with other bodies, and I'm not just talking about human bodies. I'm talking about how time becomes invented, right? I wish I could go into stories that I'm doing some research now on how the invention of our train lines and those clock time and all of that coincides with the accidents. I want to see if it rubs off on the accidents, the 18th century, 19th century accidents that gave birth to the first conceptualization of trauma, which was called the railway line. That was the first name for trauma. Yeah. Railway spine. Railway spine. Yes.
It's like, yes.
No, railway spine. Railway spine. Yes, by Erickson.
Yeah.
Erickson, yes.
There's a really an emerging research a lot on the change of our perception of time in relation to trauma. Yes. And how it's actually, and if we're looking at it culturally, how culturally, and we have a phrase for it now, we call it urgency culture. But what's underneath that is actually a generations of mutation of time in relation to trauma.
I like that. I really like that. Yeah. It feels bang on to right. I mean, if temporality is not just there, we are constantly secreting certain temporalities, and we're living in those temporalities and responding from those temporalities. Maybe urgency culture came from those accidents and the accident of industrialization and the trauma of those increasing speeds on landscapes, and all the luxuries it afforded us, but all the shadows it brought in, right? The hauntings and ghosts and ghastly, entities it brought along with it. Yeah. Maybe we're still connected with the past and connected with the future in ways that we don't know how to think about yet. Maybe trauma is time travel.
Yeah. Right? It is. I mean,
modernity is the policing of those. Yeah. Modernity is the policing of those traffics. Yeah. That's beautiful. I'm going to write that down. Yeah.
Write it down, my friend. Well, or we have the video recording of it. And it's true. It's like I work, as a clinician, I often look at spatial relationships and time in relation to trauma work, which doesn't make sense to most people, but like I look at what is their adaptability of perception of time and changes of and it's a simple practice I do of like when I do something like, can you match my rhythm? How much adaptability is there? And when there's such a lock in of how time can exist, it represents the cultural trauma, the individual trauma, the aspects of trauma that have been absorbed and mutated and locked in this sense of linear time in that way.
Yes, yes, yes. That is astute. And I think we will need modalities that help us at least bring us to the edges. I've tried to notice or bring to attention, how even our talk and emphasis on healing could reinforce this industrial or capitalist or cosmological capture of the body. This um, Faustian deal with the altars, the policing of spill. It's like I think we're in such times, brother, that we need to go beyond healing.
I mean, can we? It's a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Oh, I love that you say that. A multi-billion-dollar
It
industry.
is.
Yeah.
I mean, I just
Easily
I just
forgotten.
filmed
Yes.
or did a podcast with some friends who wrote a book on the wellness industry, and my first question to them was, is wellness a cult? What is the price for admission? And how much, like how much does it cost? And or what is truly the price for admission into the wellness industry? And healing goes within that like, we don't necessarily recognize, like, we are entitled to take breaks from our healing process, which is part of our healing process. Like like you do not have to journal gratitude every day. You do not have to buy that $50 journal of gratitude
Oh my
to
goodness.
like, that is not. And this idea of this, I am healed, it's like,
Mm,
it takes us back to, I think, what we were talking about before. We are already healed. It's just that we are taking the veils away from the experience of that embodied connection, embodied
mm.
nourishment.
I mean, what would it even mean to be? Oh, that's such a stunning statement of finality. It sounds like white modernity, and by whiteness, I
It's
don't
very
mean white people,
yeah,
but
it's very sexy to say healing and
I am healed is
healed.
with a full stop. I don't think the universe can accommodate such finality. Like you're healed.
Yeah.
That's where the trickster shows up. Yeah.
Well, I mean, even from like a physiological perspective, you break a bone, and the idea of like healed, it's not like you return to the absolute starting point from which you began. You can't. That's not how physiology works. So it's like, it is. Oh, my kiddo. What a cutie. It's there's this great YouTube video where, I don't know
Yeah.
if you saw it,
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah, yeah.
that just
Where the
reminded me.
that just happened. It happens all the time. I'm not even. Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, so it's not our physiology. We don't start from, like, if healed is this place from, like, we go back to where we began. That's
Yes, yeah.
not that's not at all ever possible, because we are always impacted, and we're always in change process.
Mm, I mean, it would seem like, yes, like wellness then becomes this Cartesian imperviousness to flows, to the things around us. Then it would look like exactly like, that, was it Pixar or Disney? Is
I
it?
think they're owned together now.
Yeah, okay. So they're now the same thing. There
They've
we
got a
go.
monopoly on the
Yes,
cartoons.
yeah. The one with the robots
Oh, well,
and Wally. Thank you. You're good. You're good. Wally, where humanity is now a spacefaring species, but even more than spacefaring, we're now highly hyper sedimentary. We are jailed in seats, and everything is convenient.
yeah.
So everyone is healed.
Yeah.
it just it just
Sign me
it
up.
becomes yes. Yes.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's like, I mean, so it's I mean, I love what we're doing in this conversation, because, I mean, and this is, I think, what you do in the world is, like, I don't mean this in a mean way, but you complicate it in a way that allows us to not be swept up in um the capitalistic kind of like easy do this, get healed. Like it is
Yes.
radically shaking up the idea of like, well, what is trauma? As we're doing, and then what do you actually mean by healed? Because
Yes.
on surface level, it's a fancy, fun word that's easily sellable as
Mm-hmm.
trauma, but like really, really, and it's not just like, it's the same thing for me via like, it's like trauma happens in the nervous system, like that particular, and I'm a somatic therapist, like and it's like, ooh, that we are not limited to one system, let alone the ecology of the world around
Exactly.
us. We are
Exactly.
sponges, as is the world. The environment
Exactly.
adapts to us, and we adapt to the environment because
Yes.
it is not separate.
Yes. Yes. So this is what the Deleuze would think about as bodies without organs, right?
Mm,
It's that we're too sponge-like to say this is a delineation, this is a parsing between us and the environment,
yeah.
right? Our boundaries are dynamic crossings, like my son just crossed into this environment now,
But
crossings through things. And it's impossible to think about the world as that form of capture.
yeah,
Yes, yes.
yeah. Oof, we are roughing up the feathers of the trauma world today.
Exactly, exactly. And I think we should get ready for what comes afterwards. Anyway, I'm just kidding. We've done I've done this
We're going to
many
be
times.
canceled. I'm excited.
The cancellation is great. But there is a growing receptivity to this because I don't think one even needs to watch a sci-fi flick around the dangers and the commodification excesses of the wellness industry, to even start to think about the ways, it becomes really highly suspicious to remove ourselves from our environments and to domicile all the things and perturbations and everything that has to do with our bodies to our singular practices.
Yeah.
Like when I speak these things, people often reduce it to, okay, so what should I do every day? Like, how
Yeah.
many times do you journal? How many? And I'm like, I'm a philosopher of the crossroads. I don't know how to speak to you about what you should do every day, but we're in such a point now that I would like you to notice that the world is also doing things along with you. And your practice of, what do you say? Let's use an example of journaling gratitude every hour at 5 p.m. every day will have to contend with what the trees are doing to you, what Facebook is doing to you, or what atmospheric, events are also doing to your body. You're not alone in this, and you're not going to get it right in a final way.
Yes. Yeah. There's a way in which I'm going to go back to sort of a simplified model of trauma for a moment, where it's the, and I imagine you're going to say to me, agency is an illusion, but
No, I won't say that. I
okay,
promise.
you promise. Okay, well then I'm going to say it.
I don't use the word illusion very much because, yeah, it has a lot of baggage, but
It
I
does
might say
have a lot
something
of
similar.
baggage.
Yeah.
All right,
Yeah.
well, let's see how you respond. That, agents, like one of the things that gets lost, or veiled again, is our sense of agency, our sense of choice in the world. And the quote unquote antidote sometimes for agency is control. And
Mhm.
so I feel like some of the ways in which the wellness industry um, has identified uh, ways in which people can feel control, which is not the same as agency.
Right.
Control is, from a very Buddhist perspective, is the element, is the grasping that leads to suffering. where agency is the ability and the flexibility and adaptability to ride the waves, to surf the waves, which include the full spectrum of experience, but it is not control. It is not the grasping.
Yes. So I wouldn't say agency is illusion. I would say agency is diffracted, right? It's spread out, right? And I think of agency, you can think of it as capacity, or the ways that some theorists think about affectivity, that is the capacity to be in response to, or in response with, in response to, and response with. And that if we allocate agency within propertied relationships, like Scott has, the way we speak about having stuff, it's a property of Scott to have agency. I think we're already late in our analysis, right? If we start, because we've again started from imperial boundaries, Scott as an isolated, dissociated self.
Yeah.
But if we connect Scott back to leaves, and back to the grieving of a seed, and back to the tumultuous migrations of clouds, and back to the swirling of oceans, if we connect you to these systems and refuse to think of you as an entity unto yourself, then we start to think of agency as something different. Agency almost as a territoriality that enlists bodies, different kinds of bodies, in how it comes to matter. So, for instance, the trauma of climate chaos. I don't want to use the same sense, the same logic of having stuff, but modernity seems to be at the end of its agency. Again, I've used propertied relations, but there you go. I've already named it. I don't know how to use the language now with my jet lab brain. But modernity seems to be at the end of its agential capacity to respond to climate chaos. All it seems we can do is to throw techno-bureaucratic solutions, philanthropy at it. But there's a sense in which maybe agency comes with certain kinds of relationships. Maybe it's only an infected body that knows how to stay indoors. You understand what I mean? Maybe we curl when we have fevers, and that's a response to something. And maybe a corona hybrid Scott body, I'm not asking that you get infected with the coronavirus, but but the coronavirus hybridized with Scott's body or my body becomes agentially accountable to a world that is in crisis, right? Think about all our activisms for 30 years, never got us anywhere, so to speak, that is transformational. But in one fell swoop, in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, so to speak, everyone went indoors. Not because of Obama, not because of a pope, not because of Donna Haraway or Dolly Parton, not because of anyone's human's agency, but because of this critter, this tiny thing that disturbed agency and sent us indoors. I feel that's what I'm talking about here, that the world is continually pairing us in new ways with things, and that's where agency comes from pairings.
It's certain, where it's in relation to the interactions.
Interactions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
And just to be clear, I did go inside because of Dolly Parton.
Okay.
Which is my interaction with her.
Okay. All right. Good to know. I don't know why Dolly Parton popped out, but there you go. That was part of the conversation.
But you nailed it. Somehow you intuited that my indoor reaction, my indoor.
No, you're kidding, right? You're
100% kidding. Yeah. I have not
Yes,
listened to Dolly Parton in a long time, but today
me
will be
too.
the day because you have
Please
brought
do.
her back into the forefront of my mind.
She deserves it. She deserves a second take.
Well, but I know that we went over from what we had scheduled, but we'll land here, and it is to be continued. This has been such a
Let's
pleasure.
do that again. Let's do that again.
I would
It
love
was
that,
a
my
pleasure.
friend.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for your beautiful time and wisdom and challenge. Oof, love it. Thank you
Thank you.
so much,
Thank
my
you. Thank you very much, Scott.
friend. We will talk soon.
Okay. Okay.